Hey, what's up, guys? My name is Josue Calderon, and I am starting this little video thing today. I don't know what it's going to become, and quite frankly, it really doesn't matter. Mostly because I'm not in control of what this becomes. So I'm okay with this just being a video for myself. And also, if anyone needs any conversation or if it sparks any conversation, that would be cool. But really, the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm trying to chronicle my changes. I know a lot of people at my local church where I grew up probably have a couple of questions about where Josue has been, what I've been up to, and maybe nobody cares. That's also the other truth. And that's okay. That's okay because mostly I feel like I know I have been changing. So you're not crazy saying that Josue's been changing. No, I have been changing, and that's a good thing, I think. And I'll explain why it's been good for me. Maybe, and we're all on our own journey. We're all on our own timeline of growth and change, and think about ourselves even like 5, 10 years ago, and think about how crazy different we are now. We're radically different people. Hopefully we are different people. It'd be a shame for a 20-year-old to say that he's still the same person that he was when he was 5 or 6. So yes, we are changing. We are growing. Some things we're growing into. Other things we are growing out of. And one of this concept of changing our minds has really been it's been at the front of my mind for a while, and mostly because a couple of things have happened to me that have disrupted my view of the world, changed the view of the world, and challenged what I previously believed. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. It's good to be challenged and to think things through and to change. I don't think it's a bad thing to change if we're changing for the best. So we shouldn't make change the enemy of how do you say that, of going to the extreme, um, the enemy of good, I guess. Change is a good thing. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. Man, some of these idioms in English, they kind of blow my mind a little bit still. But yeah, this is the idea. The idea is that we are changing, and that may not be a bad thing. So why is change so hard? I don't. We're human beings. We don't like to change, and we don't. Think about how hard it would be to live life if every day was crazy different. Like if one day, the roads would just turn into mush. Like, wow, that would cause us to go insane. Maybe we wouldn't be able to get to work. What if you lost your work one day? What if you lost an arm the other day? Like, our bodies and our minds can't take that much change. We are beings that are slow to learn, right? We're slow to learn, and we're slow to change. We don't enjoy change. Our bodies, and we like the world to be pretty much the same with as little change as possible. It's comfortable, and I think theology is no different. We want God and our view of God to be the same. And that's scary for a lot of us who have grown up in especially more traditional and more conservative, evangelical perhaps, circles where we believe that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And while that might be true, our understanding of God might change over time. Think about ourselves as kids, as little. Like, I grew up in the church, in a Pentecostal church, very evangelical and very conservative. Um, and my views of God have changed. Like, my views of God from when I was a kid um, have changed. A view of God when I was a kid, maybe God was presented to you as a God of wrath, a God of anger, and later you begin to realize, well, maybe God is a God of anger, but he's also a God of love. You start, your concept, your understanding of God begins to change. Um, and that's because you begin to possibly experience God's love, maybe experience things that are new to you, that show you that God is not all wrath, right? So change over time, even about theology, can be good if it's moving in a growth direction, in a change that produces good in us. But change is not easy, and change requires humility. It requires boldness. Boldness is big, especially when your view of God is changing and it doesn't align with what the rest of the community is teaching or still believes, holds onto. It's difficult, especially for those of us who are creatures of community, which is most of us, and I would say all of us, to some degree, are communal. We are communal beings. We live in community. We exist with other people and relationships with other people. And throughout time, it is tension. It is tension and being confronted with maybe things that are no longer matching up with the theology that we were given, the thoughts of God that we were given. They're not quite matching up with what we're experiencing in the world. They might not be matching up anymore. So usually what happens is I see it now as a gift of God to be confronted with these tensions, to be confronted with these forks in the road where you're almost forced to make a decision to either jump or not jump, either to lean into this new path or not lean into this new path. And that concept is not new. People might be saying, "Man, Josue, you're going on the deep end," but really, is it new? I mean, the entirety of the biblical narrative, the Bible, is based on people doing things that are radically changing their lives. Abraham leaving his home at an old age to go where? To go to a place where he doesn't even know. God's telling him, "Don't worry, I'm going to tell you when you get there." Like, think about how scary it is to go into something that is new to you, something that where you don't know, where you're a little uncertain, and yet that's the Bible narrative, going into places that we don't quite know where they're taking us, but it's new and it's different, but it's where God's taking you. Maybe God's taking you somewhere, and I don't know where that is, but we trust that it is a good place. So this concept of forks in the road are important. It's not something to run away from or to be scared of, not something to be like, well, we don't want change, so we're going to isolate ourselves from the world so that, we don't have to deal with these changes and that the world is going through. And I think that's a disservice not only to ourselves, but to those around us who might be in need of love and support. Forks in the road, for example. So you might be saying, well, so what sort of forks in the road? And let's go back through history, and we'll look at some forks in the road. So, for example, with Copernicus saying that, hey, here's some new revelation, right? Here's some new revelation. By the way, the sun does not revolve around the earth, and now the earth revolves around the sun, and people went insane. The theological community was losing their grip on their reality because someone else was all of a sudden bringing some new ideas into the church. Yeah, new ideas that were revolutionary, and you would be on the right side of the story if you would have sided with Copernicus and saying, yes, you know what, the earth does indeed revolve around the sun. So that might be something small, but then we get to some bigger things like slavery. And slavery at one point was actually largely supported by even like Protestantism, Christianity in the world and in the West, in the United States especially. It was supported biblically. Parts of the Bible story dealing with Exodus were removed, and those were they called them slave Bibles, were given to African Americans at the time. or Africans coming into the America, being brought into the United States rather, and so there was a fork in the road. At some point, we had to say, well, even though it is there biblically and there is support for slave ownership, we know that there's something wrong with this. We know that there's something wrong. We have to make the leap to say, yeah, there is biblical support there, but in good conscience, I cannot side with that. I can no longer be supportive of that. So we must do what is deeply ingrained in us as human beings, in seeing the humanity of another human being, the imago Dei, if you will, of another person. So we broke off, and you would have been on the right side of history to have chosen the anti-slavery path. And we see it today. I mean, we're still fighting over discrimination and things like that are very real. So we continue to make forks in the road and say, which path are we going to take? Are we going to take the discriminatory path, or are we going to choose to see the image of God in another human being and raise them to their fullest and most pure vision and image of who God created us to be? Those are the forks in the road, and we're forced to make these decisions. And thank God that we're helped to grow by our interactions with other people, and people of color especially, who can help us to fill in the gaps of information that we don't know. Maybe we don't know what it's like. Maybe we're a white person, maybe we're a light brown person, but we don't know what it's like to be in a brown body. We lean toward our black brothers to share their experiences and to teach us about what it's like to be a black person in the United States, for example. These are forks in the road, and with more information that we have, it will begin to shake our understanding of God. It will begin to shake our theologies, and that's not a bad thing. And I'll remind us of a story where, with a biblical story for this, for example, you might be thinking, well, why? I don't want my theology to change. Heaven forbid my theology would change. Let's go to first to Peter. Peter, when the net of animals descends in this vision, and he's hanging out, and Peter sees all of a sudden a net of animals, of unclean animals coming into him, down to him, and a voice that says, go on and partake and eat of these uncleaned animals that the Jewish community considered to be unclean. And Peter says, hey, God, hell no, I don't want to eat that. That's not for me to eat. That is unclean. I do not eat of those meals. And of course, this was all about the inclusion of Gentile Christians into the kingdom and the community of God. And Peter had a hard time to admit that God had made inclusion for Gentiles into the family of God. Because before it was believed that it was only for Jewish people, for the Jewish community. But now God has made a way to include others. So you see how Peter's theology had to change, and God had to create a disruption in his life to begin a change in Peter, to begin in him a questioning, a growth, a battling, a tension in him that will lead him, hopefully, to a more fuller, a more open understanding of God, a more inclusive understanding of God's people. Change is not a bad thing. We have villainized change, but change is not a bad thing. Let's keep going with other times that the church has had to create forks in the road, and that is around anti-Semitic behaviors, especially behaviors and attitudes against Jewish people and Jewish Christians in the world. Notably, not to diminish it, but let's think about times like the Holocaust, brought on by and supported by Nazi understanding and interpretation of the scriptures, and supported by largely by the German church in Germany. A fork in the road where people had to say, hold on, yes, these verses kind of seem like they're supporting our attitudes against Jews. However, the Imago Dei, again, written in our hearts, I see the humanity of someone else, and I know that this is not right. So a fork in the road happens, and we see people like theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who decide to, instead of sitting silently, decide to move toward a place of inclusion, and not only an inclusion, but an inclusion that forces you to take action for the oppressed, take action for those who are being violated, those who are being assassinated, murdered at a disadvantage. Yeah. Also, another fork in the road happens with women's ministries. I mean, let's talk about Bible verses that support women's ministry, or that support suppressing women's ministries, that support keeping women at in gender roles that are only meant for traditionally held roles for women: cooking, cleaning, tending to children, things like that. But again, we miss the fullness of our humanity when we fail to see another person's image, that they are made in the image of God, and that they have a certain quality, a skill to them that is useful not only for themselves but for the world, and we squash it. So we have a fork in the road, another fork in the road, where we have to say, well, do we silence women and miss out on all of the goodness and all of the benefits and the value of our female sisters? Or do we say, let me change my mind and see that God, the image of God in others, and I can grow and learn from everybody and from other people, lift them up to the fullness of their image of God. So we have forks in the road, and some churches have decided not to include women. Some churches have in their ministries, not to give them voices, not to give them preaching and teaching positions. But some churches have embraced it, and I think they're on the right, and I know you would be on the right side of history to include women and include women's voices. We would be on the right side of history, and history will write that down. We intrinsically know. That means that it's something we don't have to go and do research on, but we know deep inside at times that we can do better as a church, as a believing community. There's times when we know that things are wrong, that things are off, and we know deep inside that we can do better as a church community, or even as an individual believer. There's a better way. We know that there is a better way. And what tells us that there's a better way? How do we know that? How do we know that there's a better way than what we've been taught, perhaps? We know that there's a better way because we believe deep inside that there is a better way, and we know that. We just, many times we're not given the right to have our doubts and to entertain this concept that there is a better way. We think that we've already reached the fullness of what it means to be a believer, and that there is nothing left to learn, and that's a dangerous place to be. But these things force us into growth. I think about like Paul on the road to Damascus, and how he has a disruption. A disruption happens with him where he starts to think about who this voice is. He's riding on a horse, and all of a sudden or he's writing in, and all of a sudden this light comes over and he's knocked down. He's knocked down, he's blinded. He hears the voice of Jesus telling him not to stop persecuting. Like, talk about a 180, right? Talk about a 180. And it happens all because of a clash, a turn in events, a disruption that he wouldn't have been able to bring about on his own. So these disruptions are not bad. Right now, you might be struggling with your thoughts of God. They might not be matching up anymore. Maybe it's the issue of the LGBTQ inclusion. Maybe you still think that women should not be allowed to have a voice in the church. But yet you're talking to so many intelligent humans who are female and who are rocking your world. Maybe you are engaging with a lot of gay Christians who are starting to change your perception, at least begin to question and ask, well, how does my belief line up with this? These are good people. These are people who God loves. How do we begin to change our views? Or how did we at one point begin to change our views about slavery when slavery was both legal and not only legal, but it was the norm? Think about that. Think about how wrong we were. Think about how right we were to change. Think about how wrong it was to oppress black bodies, and how normal it was for America, the dominant culture, to oppress this group of people for centuries. And we were wrong. What does that mean? And I think it takes a posture of humility. It takes a posture of openness to be able to admit both that we were wrong then and that we still have room to grow. God is indeed a God of love. And I think that theology continues to move forward. To move backward to a place of slavery is the wrong way. It is the wrong path. To move backward to a place of women's voice suppression is to go in the opposite direction of what God is leading us. To go back in the direction where we are hating on our Jewish brothers and sisters is to go back in the wrong direction. To think of a world that is a flat earth and a young earth is to go in the wrong direction, like it's backward. We have to make a stop and see that us trying to return to an old and better way is not an old and better way at all. It is not an old way at all. Like Paul told the Judaizers, man, it would be better if you cut off your own dick, basically, and circumcise the whole thing. Right? I'm not being vulgar. This is just what Paul's talking about, because they were trying to force the new Gentile Christians to go through these rituals that were not meant for them in order to be included. All of these rules and regulations that were not meant for them and were instead a mask for love, where love is the ultimate equalizer. Don't be afraid of your questions. Don't be afraid of your doubts. I think God works in the doubt. God works in the space of that tension. God works in the unknown, in that space where we have to meditate and cry out. And that is God's space in the tension. So those are my thoughts for today. Got a lot more stuff coming. Let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Push back. Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're somewhere else. Maybe you find yourself alone, and that you saw this way before I did. I'm a slow learner. I'll have to tell you guys that. But maybe you saw that years ago, and maybe you came from a really old school conservative environment, and you felt like you had to leave to be healthy. That's cool. I not only respect that, but it really fits a space in me that says, man, that's something deep and something that you probably was not an easy thing for you to do, and yet I hope that it was on the right side of history. I hope that it's been good for you. Know that you're not alone. Know that just because you left the church doesn't mean that you've left God. Just because you've exited the church doesn't mean that you are in el mundo or in the world. It just means that maybe, possibly, your understanding is no longer matching up with what you're hearing in church, and the Christianese and the Christian rhetoric is just not making sense anymore. It's just not coming from a loving place anymore. But maybe it's coming from a place of fear. So hang in there, and I'm hanging in there too. I'm going through a lot of stuff, reading a ton, which has been really good, and I feel healthier, to be honest. I feel more like myself, and I feel like good things are coming. So hang in. I love you guys. Peace.